Star Wars ships draw very clear inspiration from 20th century naval battles. Big ships with big guns fire on each other, more or less sitting in the same place, while launching fast and deadly snub fighters. For better or worse, these stylistic choices have resulted in starship designs which, to be completely honest, often don't make a whole lot of sense. Now, personally, I think that's fine and that Star Wars should continue to focus on cool, but I've nonetheless identified 5 common capital ship design features which really do not make any sense. Now, I won't be forcing real-world physics into Star Wars or anything like that, and will instead be looking at things from an in-universe, logical perspective. The first and perhaps most obvious issue with Star Wars capital ships is the prominence of overexposed weak points. The best example of this is the Star Destroyer line, which is fraught with overexposed bridges, shield bulbs and sensor equipment sitting right in the open, and just generally putting everything important on a pedestal which the Rebel Alliance can easily destroy. I mean, I can understand why some of this technology needs to be on the outside of the ship, that makes some sense, but why put it in a spot not protected by turbo lasers or laser cannons? The vital parts of the ship should be in the most well-protected, most sturdy area possible. Regarding bridge design specifically, I see no reason why the bridge needs to be high up on the ship. I'll talk more about this later, but again, it's basically a giant arrow telling the Rebel Alliance, or really any faction, to shoot right at that spot. But of course, it's not only the Star Destroyer line which suffers from poor, overexposed weak spots. The Nebulon B, for example, is essentially 2 modules connected by a very skinny bridge. This was a noted weak point of the ship, and I see no reason why you wouldn't just remove it entirely. We see similar issues to varying degrees in the Providence cruiser, which has an overexposed sensor array, the Acclimator and the Venator, and even to a degree the Mon Cal cruisers, plus I'm sure dozens if not hundreds of other ships. I just don't see a reason why anything ever needs to be on the top of a tower, or why anything sensitive would not be protected by as much armor and firepower as possible. But let's move on. My next point that I want to complain about is weapon placement, with one thing in particular. Ships in the Star Wars universe are always shown oriented in the same direction. Practically, there's no need for this. It's not like space has an up or down. But even if we ignore this and there's some great cosmic force which makes ships fly with the same orientation, why do starships almost never have significant weaponry on their ventral side? Even if ships maintain the same orientation, there's no reason why they can't go quote-unquote under each other. By not having weaponry on the ventral side of your ship, there's a whole weak spot which can be exploited. Now, it's true that Star Destroyers do have some guns on their underbelly. We somewhat see that in A New Hope, and we see it clearly in Rogue One, but there's clearly far less significant weaponry there. Then we look at something like the Mandator 4, which is said to only have dorsal point defense cannons. If that's the case, why didn't Poe just make a run against the giant autocannon itself? Now, I get again that this is all for stylistic reasons, but logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're not dealing with sea, and we're not dealing with a 2D fighting landscape. This is space, and ships can go whatever direction they want. The weaponry should match this. I've talked about turbo laser placement before, specifically in my video about the supremacy when compared to other Super Star Destroyers. One thing that I'd also like to mention is the fact that the Super Star Destroyer and Star Destroyer lines put so many of their guns in this sort of flank trench, as I call it, which really limits their zone of attack, more or less to the sides. I mean, maybe they're there for better protection, or maybe there's no room elsewhere on the ship, but I always thought that it was a little bit odd. I'm not sure if having a cruiser so heavily designed for broadsides really makes sense, but that's just a minor point. The next thing I want to talk about is hangar management, and this is a sort of weird one, and one that is admittedly pretty nitpicky. It's fairly common that even gargantuan ships with a carrier focus have 2 or perhaps 1 main hangars. This is a category where the Super Star Destroyer in the lore actually somewhat redeems itself because it does have that one primary hangar, but several secondary ones, but this is not the case for many ships. Why does this not make sense? Well, it's pretty simple. You've got perhaps thousands of fighters in your ship. Funneling them out through 2 or even 4 points means that there will be some degree of congestion and that you won't be able to deploy your forces as quickly as possible. The designers of the Venator seem to be somewhat cognizant of this because they dedicated a whole upper portion of the ship to open up and let all of the starfighters out at once. However, it's very rare that a ship dedicates that much space to its hangar bay. As I said, this is certainly one of the less common issues. For example, the Mon Calamari cruisers, at least the Home 1 types, all also handle this pretty well, but I believe Fractal Sponge really illustrates what a dedicated carrier should be expected to look like. We see his non-canon Impeller class fleet carrier with literally dozens, perhaps even 100 hangars. That to me makes sense. Next up, we have the issue of windows, and I know what some of you are thinking, they're not windows, they're transparasteel. They're just as strong as the rest of the material on a starship. That's an understandable mistake, but in Legends we're actually told specifically that transparasteel is significantly less strong than durasteel. What's more, in Revenge of the Sith, we very clearly see Grievous break the glass around the Invisible Hand's bridge quite easily, and I don't think he could have done the same with the ship's hull. And it's obvious that if you're a warship, you don't actually need physical viewports. Holograms will do just fine. In fact, the Acclamator assault ship was notable for not having any sort of windows or viewports on its bridge. Space is big, being able to see the enemy probably won't have any practical effect, but even if that's what you're aiming for, you could most likely simulate it with a hologram. If I was designing a Star Wars warship, on the bridge at the very least, I would remove all transparasteel. Finally, we have number 5, the last thing that doesn't make sense. Why, in the Star Wars universe, do they not more commonly use droids to fire their weapons? Now, you may not know this, but it's not often a computer system which actually fires a ship's turbo lasers, it's a human or at least some sort of organic operator. Competency-wise, droids in the Star Wars universe are sort of in a weird place. They have very good reaction times, obviously, and can operate extremely effectively and quickly. However, they lack the real sense of creativity present in living beings. That's why droid starfighters are very interesting. They'll never be able to match the pure skill, ability, or experience of a living pilot, but they can react to things far faster. On the other hand, something like manning a gun relies far more on reflexes and the ability to follow orders, less than experience. And in my mind, especially when you factor in the ability for droids to communicate with each other, a droid gunner would be nearly always better than a human one. If the Confederacy of Independent Systems hadn't skimped out and used something a bit more advanced than just basic B1 droids on their capital ships, I think they would have had a bit more of an edge against the Republic in space. When you put these 5 issues together, overexposed weak spots, no guns on the bottom of ships, no using droids, the presence of windows, and the misuse of hangars, I think that you can say Star Wars capital ships don't make a whole lot of sense. But I would just like to reiterate, I think that's totally fine. If Star Wars wants to treat their ships as basically giant boats in space, that works for me because stylistically it looks cool, and I think that that is ultimately the most important thing, in Star Wars at least. But that is all just my opinion. Let me know what you thought of this video, what you thought of the issues I pointed out, and of course, what you'd like to see me tackle next. Thanks as always for tuning in, guys. This has been your host, EckhartsLadder. Until next time, may the Force be with you.